There is a scene that has been replaying in the minds of football people since it was first reported. A man, a father, takes his two children, 10 and 14 years old, to the Club World Cup final at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, the same stadium that will host the 2026 World Cup final on the 19th of July. He is an asylum seeker. He is not a criminal. He has done nothing more dangerous than decide that his children should see football at the highest level in the country that is about to host the world's greatest tournament. Police detain him outside the stadium. He is handed to immigration enforcement. His children watch their father taken away in handcuffs. Instead of celebrating their sport together, they watch him disappear. He is eventually deported to his country of origin. That story was not a warning that went unheeded. It was a warning that was heard clearly, documented carefully, and then seen alongside 167,000 immigration arrests recorded in and around the 11 American host cities between the start of 2025 and March of this year. 167,000 in the cities where this tournament is being held. Cities that are simultaneously hosting the most watched sporting event on earth and operating as, in the words of one human rights organization, immigration enforcement epicenters. This is the context in which the 2026 World Cup has opened, and it is the context that has quietly, and not so quietly, allowed Canada and Mexico to become something this tournament did not originally plan for them to be. The tournament's moral and atmospheric center of gravity. Not because they sought that role, not because it was assigned to them, but because the conditions surrounding the American portion of this co-hosting have created a contrast that supporters, officials, and football communities around the world have noticed and responded to. The United States is hosting 78 of the 104 matches. It has the stadiums, the infrastructure, and the commercial scale. What it has struggled to provide, and what Canada and Mexico have, in their different ways, delivered, is the one thing a World Cup needs before anything else: an unconditional welcome. Let's go through what has actually happened, because the full picture, taken together and presented honestly, is more significant than any single story within it. Start with the travel bans, because the figure that has circulated most widely, the one that prompted the most shock among football communities across the world, is not the number of countries under full restriction. It is the total number of nations whose supporters face some form of barrier to attending the American portion of this tournament. 2 presidential proclamations signed in 2025 together affect nationals from 39 countries, 39 in a tournament of 48 nations. The reach of those restrictions is not limited to the obvious examples. It extends across populations on multiple continents, and it has landed with particular force on 4 qualifying nations whose supporters had every right to expect that their country's presence at the World Cup meant they could follow them there. Nationals from Haiti face a full entry ban. Iran's situation has been documented extensively, a nation at war with the host country, sleeping in a tent city in Tijuana and crossing into the United States on match days. The Democratic Republic of Congo, making their historic debut, saw their supporters affected. Ivory Coast faces partial restrictions. Senegal, one of the continent's most powerful football nations, ranks among those whose supporters encountered barriers that placed the dream of attending in serious doubt. A Senegalese supporter speaking at a football tournament in Morocco earlier this year said something that needed no translation. He said he didn't understand why the country hosting the World Cup would want teams from Africa to qualify, but make it impossible for their fans to watch. He said it didn't make sense to him. That is not a political statement. That is a football supporter asking a straightforward question about a basic principle. When your country earns the right to compete at the World Cup, your supporters should be able to be there. More than 120 civil society organizations, including some of the most respected rights bodies in the United States, issued a formal travel advisory in April. It warned the 10 million potential international visitors of serious human rights violations in the current political climate. It cited arbitrary denial of entry, the risk of arrest, detention, and deportation, racial profiling, and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. These are not the words of fringe activists. This is a coalition that includes the American Civil Liberties Union, and the advisory was directed not just at those from banned countries, but at any international supporter whose appearance, language, or manner might cause them to be perceived as someone who does not belong. Regardless of their immigration status, the immigration enforcement situation around the stadiums themselves generated its own extraordinary episode. At SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, described as the world's most expensive sports arena and the venue hosting some of the tournament's marquee fixtures, including Iran's group stage matches, hospitality workers organized and threatened to walk out. 2,000 members of a labor union representing stadium cooks, cleaners, and service staff said they would go on strike if immigration enforcement agents were deployed at the venue during World Cup matches. One stadium cook spoke outside the ground directly. He said immigration agencies should have no role in the games. He said the workers did not want to live in fear, coming to work, or fear being detained going home. A colleague added that they were asking FIFA not to share their personal information with enforcement agencies or intelligence services. Think about what that means. Stadium workers at a World Cup venue. People whose labor makes the matchday experience possible for every supporter, who walks through the gate, standing outside their workplace, and saying they are afraid of what might happen to them during the tournament. That is not a normal situation. It has never been a normal situation in the history of this competition. The resolution, when it came, was partial. Federal officials communicated to the local sheriff that civil immigration enforcement would not take place at World Cup matches or events in Los Angeles. An assurance was given, but it was an assurance about Los Angeles, specifically for matches specifically, without a blanket commitment covering all 11 host cities and all the spaces around them, the fan zones, the transport hubs, the public squares where supporters gather before and after matches. The acting director of immigration enforcement had already testified before Congress that his agency was a key part of the overall security apparatus for the World Cup. The two positions exist simultaneously without apparent contradiction from those in authority. A report published on the 2nd of June, 3 days before today, documented 17 cases of players, coaches, parents, and supporters who had been detained or deported since January 2025. People caught during routine immigration check-ins, people traveling to football matches, parents attending their children's games. The report described what it called a broader climate of fear. Canceled youth sessions, players disappearing from teams, families pulling children out of programs, communities reorganizing their lives around the anxiety of enforcement. This was happening in the host cities of the World Cup in the 12 months before the tournament began. 13 people have died in immigration enforcement custody since the start of this year. Now turn to Canada, because Canada's story in all of this is not complicated. It is almost entirely positive, and its contrast with what has been described above is so stark that it barely needs emphasis. Toronto is one of the most genuinely multicultural cities on Earth. Football communities from virtually every nation represented at this tournament have roots there. Caribbean, South Asian, East African, Eastern European, Latin American. The sport is not a niche interest in Toronto. It is woven into the city at every level. From the parks where children play on weekend mornings to a professional club whose supporter culture has developed into something genuinely distinctive. And for the first time in history, men's World Cup football will be played on Canadian soil. Canada's own team, who qualified through a campaign that captured the imagination of a country that has been quietly building a football culture for 2 decades, will play all 3 of their group stage matches in Toronto and Vancouver. The welcome that Canada has extended to international supporters is the one the United States promised, but has been unable to fully deliver. The immigration process is clear and consistently applied. The fan festival in Vancouver is set against one of the most visually extraordinary backdrops of any host city in tournament history. Mountains rising directly behind the city's waterfront, with a stadium that sits between skyscrapers in a way that no promotional photograph could fully capture. Toronto's fan festival has been designed around the diversity of the city itself, with programming that reflects the football communities of every participating nation, not just the host country. The government's official communications to international supporters were simple, warm, and unambiguous. Come, here is what you need, here is what to expect, you are welcome. Canada's approach to the broadcasting situation reflected the same principle. The matches will be shown free, the access will be clear, the welcome is genuine. Mexico's story is more complex, but its ultimate contribution to this tournament has been similarly significant. Mexico City opened the entire World Cup on the 11th of June at the stadium that has now hosted 3 World Cup opening matches across 6 decades, carrying the accumulated history of every famous night it has witnessed, from Pelé in 1970 to Maradona in 1986. The opening ceremony featured some of the most celebrated Latin American artists in the world. The fan festival in Guadalajara, placed in the city's historic central plaza surrounded by the cathedral and the Teatro de Galedo, is the kind of venue choice that tells you a city understands what it is hosting. Not a car park, not a corporate zone, the heart of the city given over to the world. Mexico's football culture needs no introduction to anyone who has watched this sport seriously. The passion at the Akron Stadium in Guadalajara, the spectacle at the Estadio BBVA in Monterrey with its mountain backdrop, the noise at the Estadio Azteca in Mexico City, these are not manufactured atmospheres. They are the product of a football culture that runs deeper and louder than almost anywhere else on earth. When Mexico plays, the tournament stops and the world watches. And in Group A, where Mexico faces South Africa, South Korea, and the Czech Republic, there is genuine belief that this is the cycle in which Mexico finally breaks through the last 16 barrier that has defined and frustrated its World Cup story for so long. Mexico also stepped forward in a way that nobody had planned for. When the question of where Iran would train became a genuine diplomatic crisis, Mexico's president provided an answer immediately, and without conditions her country maintains relations with every nation in the world. Iran was welcome in Tijuana. The Iranian ambassador publicly invoked an ancient Persian proverb about friends revealing themselves in difficult moments. The governor of Baja California welcomed the Iranian team to her state as if they were at home. That act of hospitality, a co-host country opening its doors to a participating nation that the primary host could not fully accommodate, is one of the defining stories of this tournament. It happened because Mexico's government made a decision about what kind of host country it wanted to be and acted on it without hesitation. Here is the bigger issue, and it is worth being honest about. The United States is not a failed host. The stadiums are extraordinary. The football is happening. The infrastructure, despite the delays and disputes and funding arguments, is functioning. MetLife in New Jersey, Sophie in Los Angeles, AT&T in Dallas. These are among the great sporting venues in the world, and the matches being played in them will be watched by billions of people. Governing bodies' commercial revenues from this tournament will break every record in the competition's history. By the metrics that FIFA measures itself against, this is a success. But there is a different set of metrics, the ones that don't appear in FIFA's commercial reports. The father whose children watched him taken away in handcuffs outside a stadium in New Jersey. The 39 nations whose supporters face barriers to attending on American soil. The stadium workers who stood outside their workplace and said they were afraid. The 120 civil rights organizations whose travel advisory warned the world that coming to this tournament carried risks that no sporting event should ask its supporters to accept. The communities in Mexico City living next to a world-famous stadium without reliable water. The Senegalese supporter at a tournament in Morocco who asked a simple question and didn't get a simple answer. Those metrics tell a story too. And the story they tell is not about FIFA's revenue projections. It is about the gap between what the World Cup claims to be and what it has been able to deliver this year in the portion of the world most responsible for making it work. Canada and Mexico have not taken over this World Cup in any formal sense. The fixtures, the administration, the global broadcast, the final, all of it proceeds according to the structure FIFA established. But in the less formal sense, in the sense of which parts of the hosting have generated warmth, which cities' supporters are talking about with genuine excitement, which moments of the tournament's build-up will be remembered as examples of what hosting the world's game actually means. The contrast has been unmistakable, and the United States, which entered this tournament with more resources, more stadiums, and more commercial infrastructure than either of its co-hosts, has found itself on the uncomfortable side of that contrast more often than its promotional material anticipated. What do you make of that? You've followed enough football to know that the atmosphere of a tournament is not only created inside the stadium. It lives in the streets, and the transport systems, and the fan zones, and the hotel lobbies and the public squares, where supporters from different countries discover their shared passion for the same game. When that atmosphere is shaped by anxiety, when people who love football are changing their behavior because of what might happen to them on the way to a match, something essential has been disturbed. The football itself will assert its authority. It always does. The moments are coming, the goals, the drama, the stories that no one predicted. They are days away. And nothing that has been discussed here diminishes the quality of what the players of 48 nations will produce over the next 6 weeks. That quality is real and it will be extraordinary. But the question of what kind of welcome the world received when it arrived at this 2026 World Cup, that question has already been answered. And the answers from Toronto and Vancouver and Guadalajara and Monterrey and Mexico City have been different in ways that matter from the answers that emerged from the planning processes of the 11 American host cities. The world came to the 2026 World Cup in Canada. It was welcomed simply and unconditionally. In Mexico, it was embraced with the particular warmth of a football culture that lives for exactly these moments. In the United States, it was met with something more complicated, extraordinary infrastructure and genuine uncertainty about whether everyone who wanted to be there was truly free to come. That is the story of the first days of this tournament. The football will now begin to write a different story alongside it. Whether the two stories end in the same place, whether the world looks back at 2026 and remembers the football or the complications, that is the question 6 weeks of extraordinary competition will now begin to answer. If you found this worth your time, a like helps more than you think. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful football coverage, and let me know your view in the comments. I read everyone.